Hello everybody, welcome to another lesson. Today's lesson is on ornaments or ornamentation, and it's a guide to recognising and using most of the musical ornamentation found in modern music. The original intention was for any students who were sitting a grade 5 theory of music examination. However, it's also intended to improve general musicianship for any purpose whatsoever. Now, it's most important that you're really confident with your rhythm groupings, your understanding of the values of notes, time signatures, etc. And if you're not, you need to go and have a look at the lesson that I've prepared on that subject. And it'll help you to understand and be more confident with this before you try and understand about ornaments and ornamentation. So what exactly is an ornament? Well, an ornament is quite simply a musical abbreviation. It means that you're going to be playing more notes than are actually written down on the music itself. Ornaments, to make it nice and simple, are very similar to ornaments you'd find in your home. So in other words, if you had an ornament placed, for example, on your shelf or a mantelpiece, you just place there to make the place look a lot better. And that's the whole point of a musical ornament. It's similar, is that they are intended to enhance the music. A small sign or a small note indicates that more notes than are written are to be performed, and they've been used in music for an awful long time. Now, just as much for my ease, I'd like to use the following abbreviations throughout this lesson. WN, this will stand for the actual written note. Now, this is the main note or the principal note that was going to be enhanced by the ornament. In other words, the musical sign is usually placed on or next to the principal note, or the WN, the written note. NA, that will stand for the note above the written note. So in other words, if the written note is a C, then we'll be looking usually at a D as being the note above. Okay? And similar with the NB, that will stand for the note below the written note. So again, if the written note is a C, the note below it is a B. Okay, the first ornament I'm going to deal with is something called the turn. Now the turn is shown on the music using this symbol that I've indicated here and put a square around, so you can see it nice and easily. It's placed above the note G, which we regard as the principal note, or the WN, the written note. Now when you see this sign, it basically is an abbreviation, and it means that you're going to be actually replacing the written note with 4 notes, and they're going to be inserted in place of just that one note. In other words, the written note. You can see above the written note, the G, the turn indication, that's the sign for it. And of course, just to reiterate, the WN is the letter G, or the note G. So which 4 notes do we replace it with? The 4 notes that we insert instead of just the written note is we start off on the note above it. So that's the A. The written note itself, the G, the note below, the F, and then back to the written note. Now the problem is, if we just insert those 4 extra notes like we've done here instead of 1, the bar won't add up rhythmically. So in this particular case, it's a bar of 4/4. If we add another 3 crotchet beats, we're going to basically end up with 7/4, which we don't want to happen. So we're going to have to do something with these 4 notes that we've just inserted. So we have to change the value of those 4 notes to substitute it for the value of the written note. So in that particular example that I used, the written note was a G crotchet. So we have to say that which 4 notes will equate to that 1 crotchet. Well, the answer is 4 semiquavers. So as you can see, I've now changed the note above the written note, the note below and the written note, to equal 1 crotchet, 4 semiquavers. Now you will also notice that the notes themselves follow the same shape as the sign that indicates the turn. You can see I've written over the top the sign, and that will also help you. It's also sometimes that this ornament may be called an upper turn, as it starts on the upper note, in other words, the note that's above the written note. So what happens if the written note is actually a different value than we originally shown in the first example? In other words, it's not a crotchet anymore. Or if its pitch name changes. Here we can see that the turn is indicated above, this time a quaver, and it's the note B. Well, again, quite simply, the shape of the turn always remains the same as we showed on one of the first slides. Always the note above, back to the written note, the note below, and then back to the written note again. But this time all four notes, instead of adding up to a value of a crotchet, must in this case add up to the value of the written note, which is a quaver. So therefore, as you can see in the answer where it said played, that all those four notes have now four demi-semiquavers, which add up to one quaver, which in turn then means that the bar will add up rhythmically correct. Now in some circumstances you might need to use hemi-demi-semiquavers or 64th notes. These are basically half of a demi-semiquaver. If you've not come across them before, it's four tails instead of three as a demi-semiquaver. So you'd find two hemi-demi-semiquavers in one demi-semiquaver. So please do not concern yourself if you need to use those. Here's an example where this might be the case. You can see that the turn itself is written above that C note, which is a semiquaver. So therefore we have to write the note above the C, which is the D, then the C, then the B, which is the note below, and then back to the written note C. But this time, four notes that will equate to the same value as a semiquaver are hemi-demi-semiquavers. Now also you must note that you would group them all together to make one beat. If you're not sure about that again, please refer to the lesson I've done on rhythm groupings. Sometimes again you might see a sharp, flat or natural sign placed either above or below the turn indication itself, like these examples. Now again, the sign just basically where it is on the sign itself, in other words, if it's above, it would alter the upper note of the turn, or the note above. If the sign is below, it alters the lower note, or the note below the written note. So as you can see from the examples, the first one, we have a sharp sign over the top of the turn sound, which is over a B crotchet. If you look underneath, you can see we've got four notes in the shape of the turn, the note above, the written note, the note below, and the written note, but this time you can see the sharp sign in front of the note C. If you look at the second example, we have a natural sign underneath the turn sound, which is over the crotchet B flat, and as you can see now in the example, the lower note has now been naturalized. So what happens if the turn sound is actually between two notes? Okay, the first of the two notes that the turn indication is between is always regarded as the written note. So for in this example, it's the B crotchet. So therefore, we're going to write the turn, the note above the written note, the note below and the written note, over the note B. Now the rhythm of the turn obviously is going to change ever so slightly. So the easiest way to think about this is to imagine that the actual written note itself, the B crotchet, is split into two equal halves. So in this example, the crotchet we split equally into two quavers. And as you can see from the diagram, on the right hand side, there's the turn sound appearing over the second quaver. So the rhythm of the turn is to the value of this imaginary second half. So therefore, on the bottom you can see the first example on the left with the turn sign in between the crotchet B and the crotchet C, and therefore imagining it over the second half, we therefore get the B quaver and then the turn over the note B but to the value of a quaver, i.e. four demi-semiquavers. And then to finish the bar, the crotchet C. And here's another example. Here we can see the top left hand corner as you're looking at the screen, a turn sign between a minim G note and a crotchet A note. So if you imagine that we split the first minim into two imaginary halves, the turn sign will appear over the second half of the minim, the crotchet G. And then we look at the bottom left hand corner of the screen, you can see the same example, and so that therefore it becomes the G crotchet, and then the four notes of the turn are on the second G crotchet. So you get the A, the G, the F and the G to the value of one crotchet, which obviously is semiquavers, and then complete the bar with the A crotchet and the B crotchet. Now sometimes you see a turn sign that's between two notes, but actually the first note, the one we normally regard as the written note, is dotted, so therefore we call it placing a turn on a dot. Now how this works is just like when the turn indication is played between two notes, the first note of the written note, so in this example the turn, will be on the note E. However, rhythmically it's quite tricky, so you will need to go over this a few times and revise it to get to understand how to work out the rhythm correctly. Now, as I said in the previous slide, the rhythm is quite tricky and it's to keep the groupings correct. So, unlike other examples, it depends on whether the dotted note is in simple or compound time. Now, if you're not sure about the difference, again, I highly suggest you go and look at the lesson all about the different types of time first. So as you will know, if, as in this example, the dotted crotchet is in a bar of simple time, in this case simple triple, it's more than one beat. The dotted crotchet is 1.5 beats. However, but if the dotted crotchet was in compound duple time, then it would be 1 beat, because in, for example, this time signature 6/8 is 2 dotted crotchet beats per bar. So therefore it would be over the dotted crotchet that's 1 beat. Therefore the rhythm groupings must be different to accommodate this fact. So let's start with the more difficult of the two, when the dotted note is part of a simple time signature, i.e. it's more than 1 beat, and therefore the indication for the turn is over the dot. Okay, so as previous, the first note in this example, the note E, will what the turn is written on. In other words, that's regarded as the written note. But here's the tricky bit. Okay, first, so just like when the turn indication is between notes, imagine splitting the value of the first beat, in other words, a crotchet, in half. So in this example, that's the first crotchet, as I said before. Now we make just the first 3 notes of the turn equal the value of the second half. So we must stress just the first 3 notes of the turn. That's the note above, the written note, and the note below, the E. Okay, so in the first example we can see the E quaver, and then we've split it into 2 imaginary halves to beat the crotchet, and we put the first 3 notes, the F, the E and the D, to equal the second half. Now as you know from your rhythm structures, we can't get 3 equal notes in simple time to make 1 whole beat, so therefore we have to use a triplet. So a triplet semiquaver equates to 1 quaver. Now the last note of the turn that's missing, in other words the written note on the end, becomes the value of the dot. So in this case the value of the original dot was a quaver. So there we can see on the second example the last E note has been put in as a quaver. And then you insert the remainder of the bar, remembering to group any extra notes in the bar together correctly to form 3 equal crotchet beats in this case. So here we can see the whole example again now. We've inserted the remainder of the bar and remembered to group correctly. You can see the first note E as the quaver, half of the very first beat, and then the first 3 notes of the turn, the upper note, the written note and the note below, is valued as a triplet to equate to the second half of the crotchet. The last note of the turn, the E, then becomes the value of the dot, and then we've added the D quaver, the C quaver and the B quaver to complete the bar, and we can see the final result in the bottom right hand corner of this slide as you're looking at it. Now as I said, it is tricky, so there's a couple more examples for you. Here's the first one. It's placed between 2 notes, the first being a dotted minim and the second being a D crotchet. So you imagine that the first 2 beats in this particular case, in the first main part of the note, the minim, is split into 2 imaginary halves. We take the second half, which is the crotchet, and we put the first 3 notes of the turn, and if it's in simple time you need to include the triplet sign to make it equate to that minim, as we can see in step 2. Step 3, we insert the last note of the turn, in this case the E, the written note, as the value of the dot. So if you refer back to step 1, you can see the value of the dot as part of the minim is 1 crotchet. So finally, step 4, we insert the remainder of the bar, and you can see in the first slide that is how it's played, which equals how it was originally written. Now, as mentioned earlier, it does make a difference if the dotted note is in compound time, because of course compound time, the dotted note in this case is one whole beat. Now, it's the same as other examples. The notes of the turn actually would be based on the note G. Always the first note is regarded as a written note. But rhythmically, it's quite straightforward. All 4 notes of the turn will be to the value of the dot. So in this case, 1 quaver. So we place the G crotchet. We then write all 4 notes, the upper note, or the note above, the written note, the note below, and the written note, to equate to the value of a quaver. In this case, 4 demi-semiquavers. And then all we do is insert the remainder of the bar. And you can see by the bottom right hand slide and the example there how it's now still equating and grouped correctly to compound duple time. Now there is another type of turn, and it's called the inverted or the lower turn. Now that has a slightly different indication, as you can see by the 3 examples I put on the slide. In the first one you can see that is looks the same, but if you follow the path of the shape of the sign, you'll find it in a different direction. Or you can see the original turn sign with a line going through it. Or on the third one, what in effect looks like a backward S. So it's the turn sign stood on its head. Now the only difference between the inverted or lower turn is basically the shape of the notes. The normal turn always started on the note above. This lower turn starts on the note below and goes through the written note to the note above and back again. So in other words, it's the note below, the written note, the note above, and the written note. Now rhythmically, it's exactly the same as what you've covered so far with the upper turn. So as a little example of a lower turn, you can see there it is, a different shape to the original one. And if you look down at the right hand corner of the screen, you can see that I've drawn over the shape to show you that it follows the same shape path as the 4 notes you're going to be inserting as a turn. So referring you back, it's written on a G crotchet. So therefore, when we look at the way it's performed, you'll notice this time it goes from underneath the G instead of above it. So in this case, it'll go the F, the G, the A, the G, the note below, the written note, the note above, and the written note. Okay, and just notice again how that pattern follows the same shape as the turn indication that's written above the note in the first example. Now the next ornament we're going to cover is called the trill. You'll sometimes hear it getting called a shake. The trill has been around for many years and has taken all forms, and basically it's rapid succession of the written note and the note above. Now the reason I've now put ending in a turn is because that is how it's commonly performed these days. I've taken the most common version of this, and like most ornaments, the trill can vary depending on how old the music is that's used in. So prior to about the mid 18th century, 1700s, the trill would start on the note above. However, after this point, it always starts actually on the written note and goes to the note above. So due to this fact, we tend to call them either an old or modern trill, or you sometimes might hear them called a pre and post Mozart trill. Pre is the old trill, post Mozart is the new trill. Now by default, examination boards ask for modern versions. So we will concentrate on these trills first, and I'll briefly explain the difference between the two at the end of this particular lesson on the trill. The trill is indicated on the music as such as this little example. It looks like a little TR for trill. Sometimes it's just on its own, but most commonly it's followed by a little wavy line that looks like it's a continuation of the R. The first note C is always regarded as a written note. Now sometimes you get 2 slightly smaller notes, although in this example they look the same size. On the written script they're normally slightly smaller. Now these are called completion notes, and they're only an indication. They're not part of the actual value of the bar, so you can ignore them when they're 2 little time ones, look a little bit like appoggiaturas that follow the main written note. Now, just to reiterate, the trill itself is always a rapid succession of the written note and the note above that ends with a turn. So you just learnt about a turn. That's the note above the written note, the note below the written note. We always get those 4 notes at the end. However, let's concentrate on the actual written note and note above as the trill. Now, as a good indication, those little last notes, the completion notes, we said there's little ones, usually give you a good idea as to what sort of notes or value of notes we're going to be looking at. So in that particular case, they were demi-semiquavers. So what we do is we look at the actual written note and we say how many demi-semiquavers are in the value of the written note. So therefore the written note was a crotchet, therefore there's 8 demi-semiquavers in one crotchet. So therefore we have 8 notes to play around with. 6 of the 8 notes are used to alternate between the written note and the note above, and the last 2 notes will basically be those 2 little completion notes that you follow. So as you can see from the example, you can see 6 notes going from C to D, and then the last 2 notes are the B to C, which were the original indication of the completion notes. So there we are, 6 notes used to alternate between the written note and the note above, and the last 2 notes will be the completion notes to follow the written note. This is how they'll look. Now you'll notice that big arrow is pointing to a gap, okay? And as the trill should end in a turn, do you notice where the arrow is pointing, there's a note missing to complete the turn? We should have a C in there. However, how would we add this missing note without adding to the value of the bar? Because if we add another demi-semiquaver to insert that C to complete the turn, it's going to make it too big. All we do is we insert the missing note and we make it the last note of a triplet. Okay, so notice now how the last 4 notes form the turn. We've managed to squeeze that note in without adding to the value because the triplet is 3 in the time of 2. So therefore, we've still got the 8 demi-semiquavers. We've also obliged the rule of the written note and the note above in rapid succession, ending in a turn. And of course, the alternative to using the triplet was to make the last insert the missing note to make it 5, but then use a pentuplet, a number 5, over the last 5 notes, which gives you 5 notes, but in the time of 4. So here's another example for you. You can see the trill is written above a dotted crotchet. We have 2 little completion notes that are demi-semiquavers. So what we're saying is how many of the completion notes, or the value of the completion notes, are in the written note. In other words, how many demi-semiquavers, 32nd notes, are in a dotted crotchet? That's a dotted quarter note. So the answer is 12. Well, we've got 10 to alternate between the written note and the note above, and the last 2 for the completion notes. And there you can see written out, but with the missing note to form the turn. So we insert the missing note and we use it as the last note of a triplet. Or we insert the missing note and we include a pentuplet, number 5. So therefore we're creating the written note and note above ending in a turn, but we're also obliging the amount of rhythm you're allowed in that particular bar. There's another example. The trill is above a crotchet G, but this time the completion notes are little semiquavers. That would give the indication the trill is probably in a very quick piece. So we work out how many semiquavers are in one crotchet. 4. We've only got 4 notes to mess around with. So we've got 2 to go for the written note and note above, and the last 2 are the completion notes. So lastly, we insert the missing note, and then we make it as the last note of the triplet, or probably more common is to see all 5 notes placed as a pentuplet. So like I mentioned earlier on, things did actually change after Mozart-ish. Okay, so around about the middle of the 1700s, where it was established. But the old trill, or the pre-Mozart trill, actually started on the note above the written note. Okay, so as you can see in the first little example on the top there, the way it's written above a C, and you got 2 completion notes of a B to C. Okay, now in the modern one, as you can see from the second little example, you can see it's starting on the written note, C to D in rapid succession, and then we've got the B and C completion notes in the end, and we've inserted the missing note, the C, as part of a triplet. The old Mozart, when we start actually on the note above, you'll notice that there's no need to use either a triplet or a pentuplet, because we've still got rapid succession of the written note and note above. It's just starting on the note above. So we get the DC, DC, then we have the other DC, there's your 6 notes of the 8, so the last 2 notes, the B and the C, can form the completion note. It's already obliging the rapid succession of the written note and note above, ending in a turn rule. So there's no reason to worry about inserting an extra note or the use of a triplet or a pentuplet. It's that straightforward. Now we're going to deal with ornaments that are known as grace notes. The correct names for these are the Appoggiatura and the Acciaccatura, Italian words. And the Appoggiatura is referred to as a gracing note. However, the Acciaccatura, a grace note, is something that is really a little bit off-putting in the very label, and it's usually referred to as a crushing note. Now, if you look at the Appoggiatura, you see it's a smaller note placed before the principal written note. And in the first example, you can see it looks like a very small quaver. The Acciaccatura looks very, very similar, except it's got a line flashed through the stem and the tail of the little quaver. Now, it does make a difference because it's the values that we're going to be using to incorporate that ornament. The Appoggiatura is first. Quite simply, the Appoggiatura takes half the value of the principal written note it precedes. So I've done a couple this time in the example. You can see here's a bar of 4/4, quadruple time. There's our Appoggiaturas in front of the D minim, in front of the D crotchet, and in front of the C quaver. And this is how they'd be played if we said to use the rule that it takes half the value of the note it precedes. So therefore, if you look at the bottom example, the way it's played, you've got the C now becomes half the value of the minim, in other words, a crotchet, and then whatever is remaining, the second half, becomes the written note. The same with the second Appoggiatura, the E to the D crotchet. You'll notice we look at the crotchet, we split it in half, we give the E Appoggiatura the quaver value, and the remaining quaver value goes to the written note. And exactly the same on the next one, the D to C quaver. The D becomes half the quaver, in other words, semi-quaver, and the second half is given to the written note itself. And then all we do is we insert the remainder of the bar, the B and A semi-quavers, which then can be grouped correctly with the original Appoggiatura, as the example shows. And the little point to make is that the Appoggiatura normally would come, when it's written out, with a little couplet slur that goes between the two to indicate that that is an Appoggiatura. Now, sometimes you'll see an Appoggiatura before a dotted note. In the examples here, you can see one before the dotted crotchet, for example. In the second bar, one before a dotted minim, and in the third bar, one before a dotted quaver. Now, this time, the Appoggiatura itself takes 2/3 the value of the main note it precedes. Easy way to think about that is 2/3 is what the main note is without the dot. So in the first bar, it's the value of a crotchet. In the second bar, it's the value of a minim. In the third bar, it's the value of a quaver. And the actual principal note then takes the value of the dot, the last third. So if you look at the performed on the bottom line, you can see that the F Appoggiatura becomes 2/3 of the dotted crotchet, in other words, the crotchet. And then the following, the written note itself, becomes the value of the dot, in this case the quaver. If we look at the second bar, 2/3 of the value of a dotted minim is a minim. So therefore the Appoggiatura takes the minim value, and the written note takes the remainder, the crotchet. And finally, in the third bar, the Appoggiatura takes half the value of the, 2/3 of the value, so therefore it becomes the quaver, and then the written note, the D, becomes the value of the dot, which is the semi-quaver. Now, just a point to make is make sure that when you do it, you group the notes correctly. So as we've got it in this particular case in simple time, each of the groupings must be to the value of a crotchet. Now the Acciaccatura, although looking very similar to the Appoggiatura and also called a grace note, and as I said earlier, grace note is not a marvellous name for it, it's more of a crushing note. The difference, as we said, it's got a slash right the way through the stem and the tail of the note itself, the indication itself, as can be seen by the written example. There's one before the D, one before the D quaver, and one before the D minim. Now, quite simply, theoretically, you just have to take the smallest proportion and borrow the smallest proportion of the principal note to make the Acciaccatura crushing into the main note. In other words, as fast as possible. So you can see underneath, and this is where values, you've got to know your values. The use of the double dot is also quite common when having to write out an Acciaccatura. So if you look at the first example, we've got a D crotchet. We take the smallest proportion, which is usually a demi-semiquaver, roughly an eighth. So what have we got left? 7/8. The only way of producing 7/8, the remainder for the written note, is to do a double dotted quaver. Now, don't be frightened to use the hemi-demi-semiquavers. Hemi-demi-semiquavers, if you're not used to them, are a 64th note. They're half of a demi-semiquaver. So therefore, in this particular case, we're looking at a quaver. An eighth of a quaver is a hemi. And again, the same thing. It's a double dotted semi for the remainder, and so on. Now, the mordent is another form of ornament. The mordent, quite simply, is the written note, then the note above it, and the written note, with the first two notes of that as fast as possible. Okay. So an example, I've done 3 examples in the first one above the crotchet E, one above the quaver E, and one above the minim C. So the first 2 notes, basically we're looking at making about a quarter or an eighth each for the 2 notes. So you're looking at a quarter of the value of a crotchet, which is 1 semiquaver. So 2 notes that make 1 semiquaver, 2 demi-semiquavers, and then the remainder is the dotted quaver. So all of that value adds up to the crotchet. It's the written note, the note above, and the written note again, with the first 2 as fast as you can do them without going too over the top. Now it's the same with the quaver, just half of all the values I've just talked about. You get exactly the same thing. You can see that that's attached to the other quaver that's on the original example. And then the last one for the minim, looking at roughly a quarter value for the 2 notes, becomes demi-semiquavers, and then we have to tie it for the remainder. Now, similar to the turn, when we had an upper turn and a lower turn, or the upper turn and the inverted turn, we also have an inverted or a lower mordent. And again, very similar to the turn, the only difference is, instead of it being the written note and the note above, it's the written note and the note below. And it's exactly the same theory with regards to the value of the rhythms that are used. The first 2 notes take about a quarter of the principal note between the 2 of them. So we're looking at the crotchet for the first one. A quarter of a crotchet is a semiquaver. We need 2 notes to equal a semiquaver, which is 2 demis, and then the last note becomes the remainder. In this case, a dotted quaver. Okay, that's the end of that lesson. I hope you found it informative and useful if you're doing the examination. If you have any comments, please leave them in the comments section underneath the video, and if not, if you want to write to me, if you already have the email address. Thanks very much for watching.